So let's talk through each faction in Warhammer 40k, how they're doing right now in gameplay performance, and some of the strongest things that they can bring to bear. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking about Warhammer 40k armies and tournament stats, talking through every army in the game. Games Workshop's last major balance update to Warhammer 40k happened in mid-September, so now at this point we've got quite a bit of data as to the various different armies and open conflicts, with lots of people trying to make the best out of their factions in big tournaments, with a few really big ones happening over that time, such as the Las Vegas Open and the London Grand Tournament. Plenty of places online track 40k stats. There's Stats Hotbar, the 40k event tracker, StatCheck 40k and Goonhammer, plus Best Coast pairings for all the winning lists. I thought I'd take a look at a combination of those to see how the armies stack up by a few different metrics, primarily going through each army in terms of grand tournament win rates. They're also looking at a few other things to see power on the top tables or in more casual settings. Obviously tournament win rates aren't the only important metric. They can be skewed by various things such as the type of player that plays a faction and don't always correlate super well with success on the top tables. Though I feel like for the average 40k player out there, they're probably the best overall metric, showing what a normal player can achieve with a faction, presuming that you're going in trying to win with a list that's not terrible. To put that in some context though, I thought we'd take a look at top table success for tournaments, the amount of big tournaments where people have either placed first or gone their first 5 games unbeaten, so the equivalent of winning a smaller grand tournament elsewhere. Some factions here are much ahead of others, and I've weighted them by play rate too. Talking of which, we'll also take a look at the play rate of each faction, so the relative popularity. Usually stronger ones tend to get a bit more popular, and also take a look at win rate in casual games. That one's using Goonhammer's stats there. They've got a bigger dataset that's based on their Tabletop Battles app, so it's likely to account for a good few players with less optimised lists. In any case, let's jump straight in, talking through the factions in order of win rate, starting with the ones at the bottom end of the meta, and then moving their way towards the top. Before we do though, probably just mentioning as an aside that game balance is pretty great as it goes for Warhammer 40k right now. Literally every army in the game, besides maybe agents, have really strong ways to play, and Games Workshop in the past have had a rough target of around 45 to 55% wins, and it's genuinely pretty impressive that it looks like 26 out of 28 factions are within that range, and that's rarely ever happened in 40k's history. There still clearly seem to be factions that you're going to have an easier time winning with compared with others, and that becomes a bit more pronounced if you're one of the few people who's trying to duke it out for the top tables of grand tournaments. But for the most part, 40k right now is a lot more about actually building the right army list and then commanding it well in game, rather than choice of faction being the main thing that determines your power. Getting into it properly though, and first up we have the factions with lower win rates out there in Warhammer 40k. Though as mentioned, these armies really aren't doing so badly right now. Win rates are around 45 to 46%, which is definitely better than most of 40k's history. Usually we have at least a few around the sort of 42 to 44 kind of mark. Imperial Agents, as ever, are a bit of an outlier, with no one really playing them in earnest in competitive games, though the rest of them, despite lower win rates compared with the rest of armies, still very much have strong ways to play and people posting good results at top tournaments with them. And realistically, with 45% win rates, it's really not so far behind 50-50, similar to winning 9 games out of 20 as opposed to 10. As we go through, we'll put them on the graph. Imperial Agents just really don't have enough data to warrant it really, but otherwise here towards the lower end of the 40k meta, we've got the Astra Militarum, Emperor's Children and Drukhari. Talking about the agents briefly, and they're in the same place they've been for some time. Their actual win rates aren't super terrible at 44%, and in Goonhammer's casual to game dataset it's more like 56, though basically no one's really playing them in tournaments, so it's always going to have a lot of randomness, and it doesn't seem that anyone's managed to go 5 games undefeated with them since the last update. The last balance changes they had the Deathwatch veterans and Watchmaster points drop. Not really the worst thing for them given that they were relevant units. They've just had the Aquila team added, the Primaris Deathwatch one, though I don't really feel like it's likely to add much strength to them. In competitive play it tends to be Imperialis Fleet as the go-to, just supporting more units a fair bit better, enhancements for infiltrating and deep striking things, a few fun movement shenanigans and a useful enough detachment rule. In the fleet detachment there's often a few navy units, Voidfarers that can use the stratagems and characters that can bear the enhancements. Kyriodraxes are pretty good for 75 points, having pseudo-lone operative protection. The assassins are very nice within the agents given that you can swap between them depending on matchup. Lots of lists max out the Adeptus RBT sub-doctor squads, very tanky at 85 points for some chaff to hold the midboard, and then for actual damage dealing it often tends to fall to Deathwatch veterans, maybe with a Watchmaster. They can be pretty good users of stratagems and could infiltrate in this one. They might go fairly heavy on transports as well just to give you more chaff units to kill. Overall they're generally considered to be perhaps the hardest army in Warhammer 40k to play. Their biggest issue seems to be that Games Workshop just isn't considering them a faction to balance with the rest for game balance purposes. Any changes they've got have been sort of leftovers from other factions. Their biggest issue is perhaps being they don't really have enough to deal with tanks and monsters within their own faction, and also they weren't given a faction rule outside of their allies' rules either. It seems they're going to remain earmarked as the allied faction unless something changes for them. Next up, and out of the factions that Games Workshop does bother to balance, it looks like the Imperial Guard have the lowest win rate for the average player at Grand Tournaments. They're on 45%, which is a touch lower than it was last time around when they were more like 47ish. And it seems that more casual win rates from Goonhammer are also quite similar. Despite that though, I feel like Guard are often one of the factions that tends to have a lower win rate than most, though the people playing with optimised lists often do well at the tops of tournaments. They've had 8 players go 5 games undefeated, which puts them at far more middling in terms of chance to make the top tables, and they're played 11th most out of the 28 armies, maybe a little on the low side for a popular faction but not crazily so. Overall, seems like average Guard players with a typical list are struggling a little relative to the field, but a top player with an optimised list can still do very well with them. The last balance updates had a few small changes to the Guard, small nerfs to both Dawn datasheets, though not really big ones, Gaunt's Ghosts getting buffed despite already being good, cheaper Combat Engineers and Lord Solar, plus the Baneblade variants getting cheaper. Detachment-wise, it's still the Combined Armoured Regiment that tends to be the most played and solidly successful. Nice lethal hits plus reinforcements and flexible orders plus fields of fire. The Hammer of the Emperor with the tank focus is the next most played. In general, that tends to do a bit better in casual versus competitive, which often tends to be the case with sort of stat check armor focus lists. And as we've seen, some people have done well with recon elements, generally just being played by a few top players but not really doing well for the majority, though obviously we had the big win for that at the Las Vegas Open. The standout units for the Guard, often for damage dealers, it tends to be Rogue or Dawn commanders, often backed up by the Ross variants, particularly Vanquishers, maybe with some Hellhounds to strip cover and light the way. Kazakin with transports are good units to rush up, both in hammer and combined, maybe with some combination of Bulgrins, Krieg infantry blocks, Rough Riders and Kaschan jungle fighters to scrap for the midfield, and Scout Sentinels can do that too while lighting the way for shooting with some rerolls. At the back there's often a command block, Cadians plus a command squad and then either Creed or Lord Solar. Both of those are solidly playable, and Lord Solar is seeing a lot more play after the points changes. Then the majority of lists tend to take Gaunt's Ghost as well. Really good value with their secondary objectives, jumping on and off the board, plus doing a few other things. Overall, it does still seem that they're just lacking for a bit of overall strength. There's quite big differences between an optimised list and a typical Guard list that people might choose to play. I do still feel like there's big sections of the codex that just rarely see much use. Several of the new Creed datasheets are a bit underwhelming, as are most of the debuff artillery pieces. Perhaps being towards the lower end of the meta, they might be in a position where Games Workshop give them a bit of help though. Next up, for the Twisted Chaos Marines of Slaanesh, we have the Emperor's Children. Their on-tournament win rates are around 46%, a little lower than last meta, fairly similar in both competitive and casual games. They're the 20th most played faction in 40k currently, so a bit on the low side there, and seems that Seeks people have taken some top tournament spots with them, which like the Guards put them sort of mid-table when weighted per player. The Emperor's Children were very strong following their Codex release, though then had some nerfs, and the last balance pass sought to make Fulgrim and Flawless Blades more powerful. Fulgrim got cheaper, and Flawless Blades got an extra attack. There was a small nerf to the Lord Cacophonist. Ultimately, it seems that Fulgrim still doesn't really seem to be making the cut for the vast majority of people, though it seems that they have done enough to make Flawless Blades into a genuine option that people are taking to tournament lists now. Detachment-wise, their balance isn't good. The Kosher of the Conceited is the most played one there, giving you some early game rerolls if you can get kills in early, plus a few things that can help support them in melee. The next most played are the Peerless Bladesman and the Carnival of Excess, but they're significantly lesser played and far less successful. For their strong units, the Emperor's Children don't exactly have a huge roster. There tend to be multiple squads of Lord Exultant with Infractors, with the overall damage combo being pretty fearsome. Norse Marines providing fire support jumping out of Rhinos, maybe some with a Lord Cacophonist. The Winged Demon Prince can rush up the board and hit hard with mortal wounds, Morfiends being another rival for them for a heavy hitter perhaps. At least a couple of units of Tormentors tend to be auto-include, sticking the home objective and then having a unit to infiltrate and screen back the enemy and make sure you get the scout moves in. Lucius the Eternal is a powerful enough lone operative, and as mentioned, a few people are using a unit or so of Flawless Blades, giving you another at least fairly fearsome melee threat to jump on certain targets. Overall, I don't feel like they're in the worst spot at all. They move fast and hit hard, but really aren't all that tough, ideally wanting to capitalise with each of their blows in the early game and having a bad time if things don't go so well. Some targets might give them some issues, particularly things like hard targets they can't really deal with at range, and multiple layers of screens could be bad news for them. It feels like the single biggest criticism of them though is that Fulgrim should be a strong centrepiece for the army. A few people have been trying to make him work with his lower points cost, though it seems to be the exception rather than the rule. Before we move on, I'll just give a quick shout out to today's video sponsor in Futureproof Modular Terrain, one option for some sculpted plastic terrain that comes pre-painted. The idea behind their stuff is that it's made of a whole bunch of plastic components, and the components are designed in such a way that you can attach them in various different combinations and they hold together without any glue. So it allows you to build some fairly customizable modular ruins if you have a bunch of their bits, and if you want to adapt and change a terrain set to a future layout or just rearrange your ruins to be something different, then you can take it all to pieces and build something new if you'd like to. I feel like there's not too many terrain sets out there that both have sculpted plastic details on them, so have nice 3D effects and also come pre-coloured, so you don't need any hobby work to get them together. Here's a few of my miniatures on the real life examples they sent me, and one example of their Shrine World version. Their main offering for a full table set is around $240 or 300 painted, so around £240 or €290 if you use the Auspex code that they gave me down in the video description that gives you a 20% off. They've got plenty of other smaller or larger packs available, and feel free to take a look at their link down in the video description if you'd like to take a look over their stuff. They've got quite a few paint schemes to choose from as well, things to resemble deserts, civilized worlds, or overgrown ruins. Thanks to them for sponsoring the video. I'll cycle back to them at the end of the video to talk through their stuff a little more if you're interested. Moving on with 40k army power though, next up we have the Drukhari, who are maybe the faction that's most in flux out of any of these. They've just had their codex release, so the past 6 weeks or so will be a bit of a mix between their index data and codex data. Overall though, they do seem to be ranking towards the low end of the 40k power spectrum. Win rates are around 46%, they're 49% casually, and they have been trending a little bit lower post-codex, around about 44 to 45% win rates or so for the first couple of weeks, though bear in mind that that's really not a lot of data. They've been doing okay for some top placings at the tops of tournaments for a lesser played faction, though basically all of those were prior to the codex release, and at time of recording we haven't had anyone top a tournament with them just yet. Their codex did bring some pretty significant shake-ups to them, particularly the pain token mechanic, where every single unit now has its unique ability, rather than a few core ones, plus added a few new detachments to the mix, perhaps the witch-focused Spectacle of Spies and the Cabalite Cartel being two of the most interesting of the new ones. It still looks like initially though that most people are choosing to go Reaper's Wager. It's still a very powerful detachment with its inbuilt rerolls, which arguably gained a bit more relevance now you can't just plug pain tokens in for rerolls quite as easily. The supporting stratagems are rather excellent though for delivering units to melee and hitting hard when you get there. Post-codex, it still seems that the majority of the Drukhari codex is pretty usable. Cabalites and Venoms are nice for objectives, Mandrakes can infiltrate, and Reavers and Hellions are being used in pretty good numbers to skirmish and deal a little damage up close. For more mainline damage dealers, Scourges are still excellent with their jump shoot jump, Incubi plus either Archons or Lady Malice, and Leader Thesperax is still hard to go wrong with leading up a squad of Witches. Talos is still a nice powerful datasheet, Kronos playable enough, and Disintegrator Ravagers pretty good in cartel list. And for the HQ section, most of the things besides the Homunculus are seeing really regular play. Lady Malice herself with her redeploys and decent damage profile being a staple in most lists. Overall though, it's still early days with their codex. Will be interesting to see how they do from here and which of the detachments wind up being strong. They're definitely an army with a whole bunch of depth, with units with pain abilities, special rules, and then stratagems and detachments to apply on top. While it seems like people haven't initially started dominating tournaments with them, I wouldn't be too surprised to see a bit more success after people have the best combos figured out. Next up, we've got armies towards the sort of lower mid-tier of Warhammer 40k, these ones with win rates around 47 to 48%. Again, armies that can all be legitimately scary and strong in their own right, that perhaps seem to be just a little behind the power curve, and compared with some of their peers higher up the table, they don't tend to be winning quite as many tournaments either. Ranked here, we've got the Imperial Knights, Tyranids, Thousand Sons and Space Wolves, all with win rates of 47%, and then the Chaos Space Marines with 48%. The Imperial Knights have certainly had a bit of a come down since their power trip pre-codex. They had win rates of around about 60% and were just stomping tournaments flat left, right and centre. After their codex though, they've dropped down to 47% and more casual win rates from Goonhammer around 46%. I feel like that's actually a deceptively bad stat for the Knights. The vast majority of the time they generally tend to be an army that has a high win rate but not necessarily doing super well at a competitive kind of level, and particularly at a more casual level where armies often just can't handle their big stat lines. It certainly seems to be translating that they're not an army that's winning big tournaments currently, only 4 high placing lists that I could see so far, and that puts them almost last when weighted per play rate on that metric. They are still remaining a popular faction in competitive play currently, 9th out of the 28 armies post-codex. The codex brought some big changes to the Knights, several interesting enough options for detachments, though maybe none of them quite having the same sort of power as the Index Noble Lance with its Feel No Pains and big stratagems. At release, people seem to get very stressed about the possibility of big Knight Rush with Valorstrike Lance, leading Games Workshop to nerf it in quite a big way. Admittedly, it did seem pretty weird having a 1 command point stratagem potentially affect 3 Titanic models, which was a bit crazy, though it seems that since then the Imperial Knights have perhaps been a little bit towards the lower end of the 40k power spectrum, and notably pretty bad performance at a sort of top event kind of level. For detachments, the Questoris Companions focusing on the big guys with several really quite powerful stratagems seems the most popular. Out of the others, both the Valorstrike Lance and the Spearhead at Arms are both plays, though not quite as much as the Companions. Out of those, Valorstrike initially seems to be doing rather badly, Spearhead at Arms doing a bit better. It looks like that's nosy ahead of the Questoris Companions for win rates right now, with the big Knights providing bondsman abilities to multiple armigers for some fearsome firepower. For standout units currently, quite a lot of the codex is very playable. Maybe for the strongest Titanic datasheets, the Lancer, Atropos and Canis Rex maybe seem to do some of the best just on raw damage and defense. Most knight lists take at least some armature support, obviously lots if playing Spearhead at arms, and if you're playing that detachment it'd be things like the Defender for the -1 damage and the Castigator for the firepower buff that often tend to be popular in supporting them. Then for a bit of small unit utility, allied agents often make appearances, particularly a Calidus assassin to jump around the board doing objectives, though sisters and immolators often make an appearance. In general though, from initial impressions it looks like knights have swung from being overpowered to being a little bit weak all at once. Having low win rates at a casual level really isn't a great sign here that they can't just stat check their way to victory, even against less optimised lists. There's a few things that contribute to that, from the Noble Lance to the new detachments, though I feel like losing that Feel No Pain is quite a big factor for the amount of knight wounds that you won't have to kill relative to playing their index version. It's maybe not too big of a surprise though that they're not going to be doing quite so well at a top tournament kind of level unless they're vastly overpowered. As ever, they tend to have their stat check kind of playstyle with a bit of a low skill ceiling for clever manoeuvres. Next up, and also at 47% wins at grand tournaments, we have the Tyranids, having risen up just a tiny bit since the previous update. Seems the Bugs from Beyond are doing a bit better at a more casual level versus a hyper-competitive one with 51% wins from Goonhammer. As expected, they're a popular faction and are being played plenty at grand tournaments, 6 out of the 26 armies, and compared with a few of the factions down here, they're doing a bit better on the top tournament placings versus most, getting 12 players going 5 games undefeated or better, which puts them at 11th out of the 28 factions of 40k when you weight that for the amount of people taking them to tournaments. The last balance changes were a little bit limited. Points cuts to the Neurolictor, Turrigon, Morlock and Big 10 strong Genestealer squads. The Neurolictor and Genestealer ones were both directly helpful, though still not necessarily going to add much to army strength. For ways that they play at the moment, it generally tends to be a fairly even balance between Invasion Fleet and Subterranean Assault, both of which seem to be doing fairly evenly well at tournaments. Invasion Fleet with its big damage buffs and handy stratagems like the Feel No Pain, and Subterranean Assault with its tunnel focus and delivering Tyranid units into close strikes on the enemy. Plenty more is playable enough. Vanguard, Crusher and Assimilation Swarm all have people using them with success. Again, after several balance updates, quite a lot of the codex is playable. For big frontline damage dealers, Exocrines, Maleceptors and Tyrannofexes tend to be staples, maybe a Norn Emissary to fight for the midboard. For command point manipulation, both the Hive Tyrant and Swarm Lord are playable, the Swarm Lord in particular having raised in popularity recently, with command point buffs and debuffs. Their lone operatives are pretty well auto-include, the standard Lictor being absolutely excellent, and Neurolictors being already good and getting better with their debuffs. Warm Biovore is also auto-include to score on board control with spawned Spore Mines, and most lists also have at least some Endless Multitudes to sweep on onto objectives with some OC. A squad of Raveners makes most lists to be able to burrow around the board doing secondary objectives, and they don't have bad damage output either. A Broodlord and Genestealers is a pretty fearsome combo that can move fast and hit hard. A Neurotyrant's nice for debuffing Shadow in the Warp, and they often make an appearance alongside 6 Zoanthropes for some really punchy anti-tank, and then certain detachments will favour certain units a bit more, say the Tunnelers and the Trigon Prime having a bit more use in Subterranean Assault than elsewhere. Overall, despite a slightly lower win rate, Tyranids don't really feel like they're in the worst place right now. They are absolutely having some top event success, and they do have multiple viable playstyles. Perhaps for biggest criticisms, they can still have problems with big, tough, say toughness 11 or 12 enemy units, and they do have some detachments pretty well unplayed. It would be quite nice to see some support for Unending Swarm, for example. Next up, we have the Thousand Suns, who had quite a big drop from their performance last time around, dropping down to 47% wins from 54 or so, and they also seem to have those sort of same numbers casually. After big points nerfs, the amount of people playing them absolutely tanked. They're currently just the 25th most played faction at a grand tournament, so 4th from bottom, and don't seem to be doing particularly great on the top tables as well. 4 people managing to go 5 games undefeated or better. Not completely out of the running, and it's not terrible for a small play rate, but it's still not particularly stand out compared with most other factions. Their balance updates last time around hit them hard. They were winding up as one of the game's strongest armies after the big nerfs to Death Guard and Knights, so even given that, it felt like Games Workshop went very harshly on them. They had big nerfs to the majority of their strong choices, and Kabbalistic Rituals nerfs so you can't re-attempt them, though it was balanced a bit by the bigger Scarab Occult squads getting cheaper, plus their Sorcerer buffed, and Sekitar robots coming down in cost a little bit. It's interesting to take a look in at their detachments. Grand Coven has generally been the most popular and successful in the past, and it's still the most played, though it seems that in recent times the Rubrique Phalanx actually seems to be rising in popularity, and looks like it has the best win rates now. That's not exactly based on loads of data, but it does support the Scarab Occult Terminators rather well, which got quite a lot better, and particularly in relation to all the things that got nerfed. Seems the Thousand Suns have 2 very viable ways to play, either Grand Coven with all of its magical support, or the Rubrique Phalanx, which can be very focused around the Terminators and support for them. After the dust has settled a bit, it does seem like the majority of things in the army are playable, Magnus is still great in Grand Coven. Sorcerers and Infernal Masters cost a bit more but are still massive damage output leading Rubrique squads, maybe jumping out of Rhinos, but the sheer amount of damage that they can throw out is pretty brutal. The sort of chaff objective skirmishing role is a bit more open. Small units of Zangors, Enlightened, Sekitar robots and Chaos Spawn are all in the mix, generally wanting a few of them for their various strengths and weaknesses, though not going too heavy. Mutalith Vortex Beasts are still powerful, though maybe not quite as auto-include as they once used to be. Predator Annihilators can hit with some fairly solid anti-tank, perhaps surprisingly. And as mentioned, the Scarab Cult seem to be far more playable, lots of lists using some, and at least one of the top lists at the London Grand Tournament spammed them en masse with 30 of them. It is quite nice to see the elites of the faction actually being genuinely desired again. It feels like it's been quite a long time where they've been overshadowed by the rest of the stuff. Overall, with the big and rather harsh nerfs, it does feel like the Thousand Suns have had an overcorrection, and it's certainly not left people feeling particularly good about playing them. Those that are still going for them still seem to be doing okay on winning games though. 47% wins really isn't all that bad. They're certainly not the easiest army to play though, with quite a lot of moving parts and layered special rules that you really need to master at the right time, plus the chance for things to fail like the spells. They can be a bit slow and ponderous when on the board as well, at least outside of their psychic shenanigans. Next up, and also on 47% wins, we've got their rivals in the Space Wolves. At Grand Tournaments it looks like they've got 47% win rates, dropping down about 4 compared with prior to the update, and that seems to match their more casual performance from Goonhammer. Play numbers wise, they're a bit on the lower side at 19th out of the 28 factions. Even with the recent releases, they're not a crazily widely collected faction though, so it's not super abnormally low for them. They don't seem to have been doing particularly great at a sort of top tournament level either though. Without quite as many high placings there as many. On that metric, they're one of the lowest when rated per play rate. The last update had some small but impactful nerfs. Nerfs to Ayak Rockfist, Ragnar Blackmane, Thunderwolves and Big Bloodclaw units, a few changes to generic Space Marine support units, and a small but helpful reserves change for Logan. It did feel maybe a little bit surprising to be given nerfs when they seemed pretty solidly mid-tier before. For detachments being used in competitive play, the Saga of the Beast Slayer is still by far the most popular, though recently doesn't really seem to have been doing all that well relative to the rest. It's got lower win rates than Gladius and Stormlance right now that a few people are using. For whatever reason, the core Codex ones seem to be doing a fair bit better for win rates, despite a few powerful stratagems in the Saga of the Beast Slayer. For their unique units, the Wolfguard Terminators tend to be absolute staples, often backed up by Logan Grimnar, maybe Ayak Rockfist, though a little less so for him than before. The Head Takers are also really quite scary, maybe backed up by characters that they can do well enough by themselves, and they can create some small interference units of wolves as well. In the Saga of the Beast Slayer, the Wolfen with the hammers and shields are particularly nice. You can attach a battle leader to them for some big rerolls and damage dealing. For their special characters, Logan Grimnar is fairly auto-include, arriving in reserves early and having his command point debuff, which are both good things. Ragnar Blackmane is rather excellent either with Blood Claws or Head Takers, and Beyond the Fell-Handed can be a fairly tanky dreadnought, plus adds his command point generation. Then beyond that you can support with generic Space Marine units, Infiltrators, Intercessors, Jump Intercessors and Scouts, and despite nerfs, Thunderwolves still remain playable too. Overall, they're not really in too bad a spot still, though I feel like the nerf just felt a little bit unnecessary last time around, as they were already a fairly mid-tier army. If Games Workshop were to give them any sort of counteracting buffs, it might be nice to see things like the Grey Hunters and Njal Stormcaller getting some help. After their rather fun unique resculpts, they tend to be the ones that see the least play on the tabletop, the Grey Hunters being a bit costly, and Njal's rules just being a bit of an odd cluster of rules that necessarily aren't all as vocally helpful together as some of the more specific characters. Next up, and going up slightly to 48% wins, we've got the Chaos Marines. They seem to be pretty well unchanged compared with before the update. They currently look like they're doing just a tiny bit better in competitive versus casual. For play rates, they're around the 15th most played army, which is a bit low for them, being one of the most collective factions in the game. And they've had 9 players with top tournament performances, and that puts them fairly squarely mid-table in terms of top event success. The last balance changes didn't really do so much for them on the individual faction basis. Abaddon, the Venom Crawler and the Land Raider all got a touch cheaper, the Dark Commune a bit pricier, and Fabius Bile buffed a little. They're not really being big sweeping changes that have really changed around which detachments are good or anything. For detachments, they do genuinely have options. Renegade Raiders and Pact-Bound Zealots are seeing the most play currently, with either good fast-moving things and damage versus objectives, or the big deity mark combos there. And otherwise, the melee rush creations of Bile and Veterans of the Long War are the next most played. I'm sure some people inspired by the Veterans detachment from the London Grand Tournament. For standout units, often lists build around either Chosen or Legionaries jumping out of Rhinos with Lords, or maybe Fabius Bile for the Chosen. That gives you some solid melee punch with a good threat range into the midboard, and either advance and charge with the Chosen or via a stratagem in one of the detachments. A Lord Discordant might join them for the scrap for the midboard, moving fast with some fairly nice stats. Behind them usually comes some Chaos Fire support, the Predator Destructors being the most favoured, but Vindicators, Obliterators and Forge Fiends all do well enough. For objective support, cultists are an auto-include for their sticky objectives, and then can be a cheap nuisance unit to do actions and things. Allied Nurglings can give you cheap infiltrate into the midboard, and things like Bikers and Raptors can skirmish around and be a good mix of damage and utility. Scythe is also rather good on that front, being the Chaos Lone Operative with a surprising amount of damage punch once he gets close. Warp Talons can be nice enough for their jumping off the board, and Possess can give you a bit more of a damage leading fast unit to rush for the midboard, perhaps being particularly standout in creations of Bile. Again, Chaos Space Marines seem to be in an alright spot, win rate's really quite close to 50%. And a good few options for playstyles and detachments if you want to. I feel like perhaps the single biggest criticism would be that half the detachments just feel like they could do with some serious rule rewrites. The ones that are themed around, say, the Alpha Legion, Night Lords and Iron Warriors all tend to be very niche or bad in their own ways, and that does feel like a bit of a swing and miss given that there's lots of people who collect those individual factions. There's maybe a little bit less excitement around the detachment as well, not really quite so many people tempted to put them on the table as normal. Moving just a little higher, and let's take a look at the middle of Warhammer 40k. Lots of factions lining up on the sort of 49 to 50% win rate kind of mark, and it's really good to see quite so many armies clustered around the centre point here. I feel like perhaps a couple of these could be argued to be a fair bit stronger than the tournament win rate might suggest though, in particular the Space Marines, where there's a big gap between optimised lists with some of their top detachments versus the average player experience, and Space Marines are doing rather excellently on the top tables, and Chaos Knights perhaps have outsized performance both at a top competitive and also a casual level, thanks in no small part due to the horror that is the dual Gatling Despoiler. In any case, adding them to the main table though, here we have the Leagues of Votann, Dark Angels, Blood Angels and Space Marines all on 49%, and then the Chaos Knights, Death Guard and Orks on 50%. Out of these armies that seem to be winning 50-50 for the average player at a grand tournament, first up we have the Leagues of Votann. They've really not so very long had their new codex now with their new wave of units. They still seem to be sticking fairly solidly to the 50-50 kind of win rates that they've had through quite a lot of 10th edition. They seem to be doing quite well by top tournament performances, 10 players having gone 5 games undefeated or better. And that's a bit more impressive weighted by their play rates, only just behind some of the very top factions there for your chance to take these guys to the top tables. For their last balance changes, they had their codex with their new units and detachments. The only small changes that they had in the balance stage slate was a nerf to an unusual Bramfast Oathband stratagem that allowed some overly easy charges. Over the past 6 weeks or so, Nilgar Oathband has remained the most popular out of the detachments. That one adding in some pretty straightforward big hitting damage, defense and a few useful support options that does require managing some yield points to do so. Bramfast is the next most popular, supporting units fighting near transports with sustained hits. Interestingly, it recently looks like the Hearthband, the Grotmas formation that focuses around the Einir Hearthguard, has been gaining some popularity, with a small subset of players seeming to be doing rather well with that. Games Workshop did update that near the codex to shift around the core rule a bit, and new style cheaper Einir Hearthguard seem to be doing enough to support that rather well. For their units, they feel like they're kind of impressively well balanced in that no units are outright terrible. You can use everything if you really want to, though a lot of things are maybe a bit more mid or niche, and there's a few things that really stand out. The Brockir Thunderkin with either their grabbed cannons or big combos around their sustained hits conversion beamers are often staples and lists. Einir Hearthguard also popular in a number of different roles, and Steeljacks can be a fairly sturdy core unit to deal a bunch of damage and take some punches in return. For character support, Uthal the Destined with 3 stratagems and Memnirs to manipulate yield points are both common. Most lists build around the Hecaton land fortresses, often with a pair of them at 2,000 points, maybe more in Bramfast. They're big tough and have some heavy firepower with their railguns. And then for objective support and scoring, Jaegers split with a Capricus are another excellent choice. Give you several small units and still doing the infiltrating board claiming. Ernkin Pioneers can move up behind them, and maybe some Hearthkin could be nice to guard Uthar and give you sticky objectives, perhaps with Sagittars. Most things are very usable though. Chthonian Berserk still nice charging out of transports, and some make use of their artillery pieces. Overall doesn't really feel like there's too much to criticise with them. Maybe a few of the HQ choices like the Grimnir just feel a little bit redundant and not adding too much. And comparatively they maybe tend to be a bit slow and shorter range relative to other 40k armies, and not having quite so many sneaky tricks as some. It seems to be more of a playstyle thing than necessarily something that impacts their strength though. Next up, we've got the forces of the Unforgiven Dark Angels, also on 49% wins, which has risen up a bit since the previous meta when they were more like 46 or so, and it seems like they're doing fairly equally well at a casual level. In terms of play rates, they're pretty mid-table at 14th out of the 28 armies, and those players have taken 5 top placings at tournaments, a little bit low relative to the people playing them compared with the other factions out there. The last balance changes didn't have huge changes for the Dark Angels, but buffed a few things. Lionel Johnson being able to take 2 of his Primarch powers was probably the biggest impact thing. Nice to say both had mortal wound protection and also his damage buff on the go, for example. That was good to see some help for both the Ravenwing Dark Shroud and Landspeeder Vengeance. I've seen some people trying them out in competitive lists, that they're still slightly niche choices, and I wouldn't be too surprised if people are a bit put off taking them, given there's a good chance they could get some Ravenwing updates in the not too distant future. For what the strong arms are using, the Wrath of the Rock is easily the most played thing. It was nice to see an actual unique Dark Angels detachment take over as the main staple. It does perhaps seem to be one that does a bit better in casual versus competitive though, with its core rules focus being on making your units tougher. Otherwise the main rivals, as often, are the Stormlance and Gladius Task Force, both of which are played by good numbers still, seem to be doing well, maybe a bit better on average at a tournament level. For their standout unique units, there's just a few data sheets from the Dark Angels that really see loads of play. Deathwing Knights and their big raw might and -1 damage are in almost every list. Azrael's an absolute auto-include with his damage buffs, invulnerable save and command point farming. Kind of impossible to go wrong with him with 115 points. He might be leading a squad of the fighty inner circle companions, less tough but more damage versus the Deathwing Knights, but they can also work well with other characters like a Judas here. And Lionel Johnson has gradually moved up to be in the vast majority of Dark Angels lists now. A big central and scary melee threat with fights first is really hard for a lot of armies to deal with properly. In the Wrath of the Rock in particular, some shooting combos see a bit of play, with Sternguard and Hellblasters being a bit more tempting. Quite nice with the +2 strength there, and as with the other divergent chapters, they see a lot of support from the generic Space Marine units, things like Scouts, Jump Intercessors, the Combi Lieutenant and Intercessors, plus maybe some fire support vehicles. The Ravenwing units are playable enough, but tend to be a bit more niche, maybe not quite having the same sort of auto-include rules crunch, and a good chance to have updates in the sort of medium term for 40k probably puts off a few people getting them. Otherwise for army issues, the Wrath of the Rock just doesn't really seem to have all that much top tournament success, so basically maybe seems better for winning games as opposed to taking events. And otherwise, outside of the Lion and Azrael, most of their character data sheets have things to be desired, just not really all that good for the points that you pay for them. Next up, we've got the Blood Angels, also on around 49% win rates. They seem to have stayed pretty well where they were prior to the balance updates. Still in a good position with lots of people keen to put them on the tabletop, the 10th most played competitive army, and still doing well enough for top event performance, 12 either tournament wins or 5-game undefeated runs at the start of events. That puts them comfortably on the upper end by that metric. The last balance change had an interesting sort of side grade for them, Sanguinary Guard getting pricier than their very cheap points cost, but going up to Weapon Skill 2+. Neither really making them better nor worse, they're making Dante a little bit less viable to field with them as they don't need his +1 weapon skill anymore. They also had Space Marine points changes as well. Big squads of Blade Guard going up a tiny bit was impactful for them. For their detachments, it's split between their Liberator Assault group and the Angelic Inheritors, more playing Liberator and particularly casually. Though at tournament sort of levels, it looks like around about a third of people play the Angelic Inheritors, and both seem to do well enough, both solid enough win rates and doing well to top events. For their standout units, Sanguinary Guard still remain one of the mainstays of the army, perhaps be a bit more likely to be fielded alongside Jump Captains rather than Dante now though, and very much so in Angelic Inheritors. For other big damage punches, both small and big squads of Jump Death Company, the big ones with Lamartis often tend to get played, having a bit better damage output than the Sanguinary Guard. Otherwise, captains with Assault Intercessors, maybe particularly with Rage Fueled Warrior, are excellent value. All the sort of small skirmish Space Marine squads can hit far harder here, Jump Intercessors, Vanguards, Scouts, and all the more other standard Space Marine skirmish infantry. Both the Sanguinaur and Mephiston are rather standout lone operatives, very scary with good damage output and fights first, and again they often tend to get backed up by a small amount of Space Marine firepower of one flavour or another. Overall, the Blood Angels still seem like they're remaining in a good place. It's maybe a bit annoying that Dante doesn't work with his guard quite as well as he used to. I'm not sure if it could be worth with Games Workshop changing around his buff to make him actually work with the Sanguinary Guard a bit better. Despite a few points changes, it's still kind of rare to see the Foot Death Company or Death Company Dreadnoughts played quite so much, and rather a shame that the Death Company detachment still feels like it's directly inferior to Liberator. Overall though, they're really not in the worst spot in the world. Lots of good options to move fast and hit hard, though they might struggle against armies with melee counters, heroic intervention and fights first, and there can be some pretty big decisions as to where they're big hitting jump pack punches. The standard Space Marines are also joining them on 49%, a big rise from the 44% that they were prior to the balance update, and tend to be doing better in competitive events versus more casually right now. As I mentioned a second ago, they're an army where there's some big disparities at the moment. An optimised Space Marine list played well is rather excellent on the top tables. They are the most played faction, but they're also the one with the most tournament wins or 5-game undefeated runs. They have 23 of those, which even when you weight it per play rate is still the 6th highest overall. An optimised Space Marine list played by a good player is absolutely one of the strongest things that you can play in Warhammer 40k currently. The last balance update had a bunch of small changes to units, cheaper Redemptors, Land Raiders, Aggressors, and the Gladiator variants, though pricier Guilliman, Ballistas, Dreadnought, and Blade Guard. With the latest crop of Space Marine releases though, there's been really quite a lot of special characters and new options added in. The single biggest win for the Space Marine seems to have been the gain of Ethon Sharn and the Shadowmark Talon for the Raven Guard. Both a fairly godly lone operative datasheet and then an absolutely excellent detachment to put him in. Vanguard already had its interest, but this one seems flatly improved with that, particularly with not having to spend command points to put units back into reserve. Some of the other options have also been interesting, like the Forgefather's Seekers, and now Iron Hands and White Scars attachments are entering the fray as well. It looks like the White Scar Spear Point has already won a grand tournament. At least for the more established ones though, it looks like Shadowmark Talon is perhaps the single strongest form of Space Marines currently. Perhaps not quite so many people playing it given quite specific model requirements, but it looks like that one has win rates over 60% and lots of top event performance. Otherwise it's maybe Gladius and Stormlance most commonly for the Ultramarines, with a little play for Vanguard, Ironstorm and Firestorm, and maybe Forgefather Seekers for the Salamanders. For the Ultramarines, Guilliman and Calgar tend to be the biggest staples. Guilliman pretty game changing with double buffed Oath plus discounted stratagems nearby, and having Calgar not generated command points unless with Guilliman doesn't seem to be enough of a turn-off to stop people playing him. We might have a bit more to go on that front with the Victrix Guard and Cato Sicarius once they get their points costs. At least on paper they're looking like a pretty thoroughly fearsome unit with those crazy movement rules that they have, though they might have a very high points cost. In Shadowmark Talon it usually tends to be Centurions, Inceptors, two big units of Vanguard veterans with Ethon Sharn and Kayvon Shrike. That seems like the kind of cookie cutter build for them. One of those Vanguard veteran squads turning up turn 1 with Hunter's Instincts. Beyond that, Space Marines just have lots of good units to fill out the sort of utility unit kind of role. Cheap expendable infiltrating scouts, infiltrators that can deploy forward though equally just guard the home field with denied deep strike, intercessors for sticky objectives, incursors to mark targets, and jump intercessors for a nice mix of deep strike, fast movement, and a bit of damage. Most lists also take a combi weapon lieutenant, very nice for utility and secondary purposes and hard to catch up with his rules. Then several lists tend to take a bit of heavy armour to back them up for some serious firepower, maybe things like Gladiator tanks, Ballistas Dreadnoughts or Redemptor Dreadnoughts after the points cut, though the core damage dealer combos of any given army might vary a bit depending on detachment or chapter. Overall, Space Marines feel like they're in a good place, solid enough on average win rates, and seeming to be one of the very most powerful factions in the game at a top level with an optimised list, though as ever some chapters tend to do better than others, and the average player's collection really might not fit into a current optimised list at any given point. Next up, and on 50% wins, we have the Chaos Knights. Along with the Imperials and the Death Guard, they were dominating the meta fairly recently, then got their points nerfs prior to the balance update, which dropped them down to around 53% or so, and it seems they've fallen just a bit further since then. Looking by Goonhammer's more casual win rates though, it looks like they're a bit higher, around about 54% there, so one of the highest in the game. It's not exactly too uncommon for Knights and Custodians to do a bit better at a casual level versus top competitive though. Interestingly, however, it does seem that Chaos Knights have been doing kind of well at a top tournament level recently. 13 armies either going 5 games undefeated or winning games, and that puts them 8th on that metric per play rate, despite remaining really quite a popular faction, being the 8th most played out of the 40k factions currently. Their last balance update had some rules nerfs to back up the points nerfs. The Lords of Dread sticky objective stratagem got toned down, Infernal Lance had its core rule slightly nerfed for the defensive version, and Abominant Knight's mortal wounds don't stack if you have multiple nearby. The thing that seems to be propelling Chaos Knights to be doing rather well at the moment though is basically one single datasheet in the dual Gatling Despoiler. 36 shots worth of strength 6, AP 2 and damage 2 firing out of the thing, plus some secondary weapons, and if you put that in Infernal Lance you can either get sustained hits or lethal hits every turn, the lethal hits just turning it into a ferocious anti-everything gun turret. As a result, Infernal Lance is now kind of massively dominant versus the rest of them, and it does have some okay support for other knights as well, but ignores cover stratagems and assault keyword enhancements can further buff that already scary damage output. For some of their strongest lists, it's maybe a bit depressingly common to see triple dual Gatling Despoiler. They're maybe backed up by 3 Carnivores and some other things, perhaps some Wardog Stalkers or perhaps some allied demons, Nurglings, Beasts of Nurgle, and occasionally bigger ones like Rotagus. That seems to be the cookie cutter Chaos Knight build. Most of their other Titanic Knights are viable to a greater or lesser extent though. The Rampager, Lancer, Abominant, Atropos, Desecrator and Tyrant, all of those are solidly usable. Overall feels like the Chaos Knights are doing okay power wise, certainly not too weak either at a casual or competitive level. The main issue is that dual Gatling Despoiler datasheet seems to be carrying the whole faction based on one detachment, and it does suppress other options a fair bit. Maybe a shame given that the Chaos Knight armies tend to be at least fairly varied when they had their brief period of dominance with lots of cheap ones. I can't help but think that if you directly break that damage combo with the big scary Gatling Knight, then the faction's probably going to lose at least a fair bit of strength, though it feels like it'd be nice to see the rest of the field catch up on that a bit. The Death Guard also seem to be on 50% wins, both in competitive circles and casually. Following their period of massive dominance after their codex came out, they're still one of the very most played factions in Warhammer 40k, third out of the 28 armies, though notably per play rates they're really not doing all that well at actually getting to the very tops of tournaments, only 6 players managing there, and weighted per the amount of people playing them that actually puts them towards the very bottom of Warhammer 40k in terms of success at the tops of tournaments per the amount of players that they have. The last balance update didn't really have any further changes for them. Like the Knights though, they got their big points nerfs early, hitting most of their staple units, though Games Workshop choosing not to hit them so hard that they become completely useless, instead just being a little bit more in line with other armies stuff. For detachments, it still seems that the same 3 haven't really gone anywhere, Virulent Vectorium still being the most popular for balanced play company with sticky objectives, and some nice enhancements for a Demon Prince and Lord of Contagion. Then Champions of Contagion for the character focused one, and Mortarian's Hammer for handing out Afflicted, dealing better damage at range and delivering Death Shroud. For their staple units to bring Nurgle's blessings far and wide, Death Shroud Terminators are some of the single most auto-include things, usually with a Lord of Contagion in tow. Being able to drop in at 6 inches against an afflicted unit and then get a serious amount of scary melee damage, almost no questions asked, is a really big deal, though the damage combo is a pricey one and they're quite slow when they are on the board. Otherwise, for absolute staples, it's rare to have an army without Poxwalkers taking the mid-board, getting those afflictions forward early and potentially move blocking the opponent if it ever makes sense. Plague Marine damage combos jumping out of Rhinos are still a really big deal. They cost a lot of points but just have ridiculous damage output, to the point where they're wrecking core durability units for the enemy. Demon Engine support is fairly powerful, Bloat Drones with the Blight Launchers are still general purpose gun turrets, and Mephitic Blight Haulers good against elite and tanks, and plenty more beyond that's playable. Mortarian himself with his reactive moves and big stats, the Demon Prince with the 5+ Feel No Pain and Virulent Vectorium, Typhus is nice enough, and a lone Tallyman can farm up some command points. Again, Death Guard feel like they're in an alright place. I feel like Games Workshop did a good job by nerfing the points but not the rules. They've got lots of power, some cool tricks, and are winning plenty of games. I'm not sure if it's just being relatively slow moving and often needing to get close to have best effect that might be limiting them a bit more at an absolute top tier competitive level, but it does look like a lot of people still have plenty of enthusiasm to put Mortarian Sons on the tabletop. Next up we have the Orks. They're also on win rates of 50% and they've risen up massively post balance update. They were down at 43% or so before. They're still maybe a little bit lesser played relative to how they might be normally, around 13th most played at a competitive level in Warhammer 40k, though it seems like the Death Guard not quite so many lists actually making it to the very top, only 5 actually winning grand tournaments or going first 5 games undefeated. The last balance update had really quite a lot of fun stuff for Orks. There are lots of good points cuts, some of the stuff that went up a bit needlessly last time around getting reversed. Snickrock going down to more acceptable levels was quite nice, and then they got a fair few fairly impactful rules changes. Commandos being able to split into 2 small efficient units was a really big deal. Gazgor being able to join boys was nice, and a few other things had some small improvements as well. Detachments wise, as normal, Warhorde with its melee violence is still by far the most played. Extra hitting power in close combat, some nice damage and defensive stratagems, and a bit of help in getting the greenskins there are all good things. There is a fair bit of variety though, and some are playing bully boys and tactical brigade. Some of the points cuts for things like mega knobs and flash kits particularly helped those, and they also seem to be doing fairly well by the numbers. For standout units currently, Commandos chopping into 2 units, jumped from being a bit niche to being pretty well auto-include for cheaper utility units to scrap for the midboard. Gazgor with a big unit of boys makes his way to the heart of most army lists. He can join alongside a pain boy or a big mech for a little bit more speed. Most of the flavours of melee violence are rather nice jumping out of transports. Boys, knobs, breaker boys, beast snaggers and mega knobs, and flash kits and tank busters can be nice as well. Maybe a bit more emphasis on them in tactical versus elsewhere. They'll usually be delivered by trucks or kill rigs or wagons, and then to help score points and objectives, Gretchen absolutely auto-include with their command point generation. Maybe some Storm Boys for their deep strike and speed to do some secondaries too. Overall in a far better place than they were before the update when they were really struggling. For criticisms of the faction, Buggies, Planes and Walkers are still rarely used, and they still don't really seem to be powerful enough to make the Dread Mob a scary prospect overall. Powerful detachments does mean that several units can just be a bit weak outside of their thematic one, and that feels particularly the case for things like the Cult of Speed and Dread Mob, where plenty of the units just sort of limp into okay there, but really aren't particularly strong elsewhere. Next up, we've got a bunch of armies that are just about breaking through 50%, all of these are either 51% or 52%, maybe slightly upper mid factions as Warhammer 40k goes. Plenty of them able to do well enough at the tops of tournaments, but I feel like these ones here do include a few armies that just haven't really had quite as many grand tournament victories, even if clearly the average player is certainly managing to hold their own against most armies with them. Realistically, their win rates are barely any higher than the ones that we just talked about, and it's still great to see lots of armies clustered around the midpoint. Adding those onto the overall chart, and here we have Adeptus Custodes, World Eaters, Black Templars, Genestealer Cult, Grey Knights, and Chaos Demons. For the Necrons, they're on 51% wins, a small rise since prior to the update, though it does look like everyone's favourite living metal skeletons aren't doing quite so well in casual play. Goonhammer has their win rates just a little bit lower. They're a widely played faction and still very popular to put on the table in competitive tournaments, 5th out of the 28 currently, are doing well at winning or going undefeated in events, though when weighted for numbers playing them, they're a bit more mid-table. The last balance change was quite a small one. The Silent King went down in points but had one of his buffing rules swapped to a movement one, and the Triarch Praetorians got cheaper, enough to see a few people play them but not really be a staple. They've just had an influx of data sheets that haven't really hit events yet, with the Geomancer, Tomb Crawlers and the Macrosites. Out of those, I'd guess that the Tomb Crawlers will be most likely to make appearances, some of them being subbed in for Crypto Thralls. Detachments-wise, most Necron players are playing either Starshatter at Arsenal or Awakened Dynasty currently, Starshatter with extra damage against things on objectives, and lots of support for Doomsday Arcs, Triarch Stalkers and the Silent King in particular. Awakened Dynasty with its damage buffs for leader combos, and again nice stratagem and enhancement support, including resurrecting characters. Beyond that, both Hypercrypts and Canoptek Court see some play, though typically a bit less success. For common units for competitive lists, big blocks of durable wraiths with a Technomancer are hard to go too far wrong with for a frontline bully unit to absorb some damage. Both the Silent King and Doomsday Arcs are powerful anywhere, though more so in Starshatter than elsewhere. The Triarch Stalker can often do well in a Starshatter list as well, perhaps rivaling wraiths for the durability combo, warrior blocks with Orokin and some Crypto Thralls, perhaps a Royal Warden and then some fairly maximal reanimation support between things like Ghost Arcs, Canoptek Reanimators or Resurrection Orb Command Barges. They've been at the heart of several Necron lists, able just to march up to the mid-board and survive on an objective. And around some of the big hitters and durability units, they've got lots of good support units, Ophidians burrowing around the board, Flayed Ones infiltrating to take the midfield, Death Marks and Hex Marks deep striking, and the Hex Mark can be good for bearing certain enhancements like the -1 damage one for the Silent King. It feels like most units in their roster are solid enough though. Imitek can farm command points, Illuminor Zeraz has good stats and supports the warriors well, and Locust Destroyers and Heavy Destroyers can be interesting enough both when maxed up for big damage combos or even just individually as nuisance units. In Awakened Dynasty as well, Scorpex with a Scorpet Lord and can hit very hard on the charge, particularly against elite units. Overall, Necron seems to be holding their own, both in terms of average wins and on the top tables. Maybe for any criticisms, they can be a little slow and a bit low damage output if going super heavy on their durability combos. I feel like for any criticisms of their army balance, it would be nice to see a bit more support for sort of core warrior and immortal combos, outside of just min-max reanimation support all around 1 or 2 super units. It might be kind of hard to balance that, but it might be nice to see a few more overlords and immortal or warrior shooting combos with some cryptex happening. Next up, we've got the Golden Auramite Guardians of the Adeptus Custodes. Win rates around 51%, having risen up a little bit after the other stat check armies like Knights and Death Guard got nerfed, it would seem. And they are doing a little bit better on casual tables, with Goonhammer stats having them at around 53%. They often tend to do a bit better just with their raw might at sort of RTT levels or more casually. They're still popular to play at competitive events, being the 12th most played army, but very rarely see the top tables, only having 4 victories there. And that puts them as one of the very worst armies when weighted for the amount of people playing them in terms of getting top event placings. Overall, they seem to be better at bullying mid-tables or RTT level, as opposed to the best players around. The last balance changes saw a few improvements for them. Having standard Custodian Guard get cheaper in points was quite a big deal, and there's more people using those as a rival to the Wardens now, when it tended to be Wardens for the most part before. The regular Shield Captain and some bigger Sisters units got decreased as well. For detachments, it's still the Lines of the Emperor that tends to get the most use. Custodes with +1 to wound buffs fighting in isolation, plus some nice enhancements and stratagems to skirmish for the midboard. Perhaps compared with before though, there's a bit more love for the alternatives. The Shield Host and the Solar Spearhead both have fairly good player numbers, and both of them seem to be doing well on win rates and stats as well. Those Custodian Guard are often still backed up by Kyriadraxus for the big shooting combo. Wardens and Blade Champions are still a staple, moving forward a bit more quickly and being very durable to kill once they get there. Having Trajan Valoris in the mix and Lines of the Emperor for using his Moment Shackle twice can be another good one. Alorus Custodians with their teleport tricks and the potential to split into smaller units can be nice with Lines of the Emperor. Both the Virtus Praetors and the Venatari Custodians can be good for the fast attack kind of role, and the other Shield Captains can be nice enough, perhaps particularly in Lines of the Emperor once again, where they've got good enhancements to support their damage. The Necaladius tank or 2 is a good source of anti-tank fire at longer range, and then there's usually a few Sisters of Silence units to score points and do expendable things, and perhaps a Calidus Assassin to bounce around the table doing secondaries. Overall, Games Workshop's got most of their units in a pretty good place, and there is a bit of variation with detachment plays. They generally seem to be doing what Custodians do rather well, a bit of a predictable stat check style army, better in casual levels versus competitive, and maybe a little bit at the mercy of big 4+ invulnerable saves, where if you make or fail a lot of them, then you could have a very different game indeed. Played well though, it certainly doesn't mean they're any sort of easy foe to overcome, even if the best players might have a bit more chance to play around their big stats. Next up, and also on 51% wins, we have the World Eaters, fairly similar to where they were pre-update, despite some big changes to the army, and doing fairly similarly both in competitive and casual play. Despite in-game power levels remaining at least kind of similar, it seems that people resonated pretty well with the changes, jumping up to the second most played faction in the game, just behind Space Marines and not far. Easily the most widely played World Eaters have ever been in their short faction history. Despite or because of that massive influx of players though, it doesn't actually seem like the average player's doing great at actually topping tournaments. They've got 11 event wins or 5 game undefeated runs, and that actually means that they rate really quite low down the table if you weight that per player numbers. They're only 20th out of the 28 factions there. I say if you compare it with Space Marines, who've got similar sort of play rates and similar win rates as well. The Space Marines have around 23 of those big performances, so the World Eaters have less than half. For the changes that they had, their spawn got a bit pricier, Khan the Betrayer went up to 100 points, and Forge Fiends went up a bit, but it got fairly well balanced out with some much cheaper 8-bound. Both units went down, and the Exalted 8-bound got a pretty monstrous damage buff against vehicles. The Slaughterbound got a melee damage buff, and both Angron and Terminators went down a bit, though not really quite enough to make most people want to play them. For detachments, there's not really much competition with the Berserker Warband. +2 strength and +1 attack on the charge is great in a melee army, and they've got some decent enough strats and enhancements, things like sticky objectives on death, extra AP, and some good ones for Berserkers to strike out at a very long range. Most of the units in their roster are very usable. Spawn and Jackals for the supporting objective sort of role are rather great. Lots of lists are using multiple units of Spawn to rush up the board and get in the opponent's face and destroy some utility units. Jackals can sticky the home objective, and while they're less auto-include, still plenty of people use Goremongers for an infiltrate option. Khorne Berserkers do seem to be a bit more rightfully at the heart of the army than they have been at the past. There's almost always a unit of 10 of them in a Rhino with Khan the Betrayer, who does enough to tip them into being an utterly murderous unit, but in more recent fashion there's been a lot of people running big squads of 20 of them as well, often with a Juggernaut Lord to get them there faster. A Demon Prince with the -1 damage Helm of Ire is rather nice. Forge Fiends and Hellbrutes are both strong in their own ways, and then both varieties of 8-bound see some pretty solid play, though don't really tend to be spammed massively. One squad might join with a Slaughterbound, who often takes the Berserker Glaive for extra damage and an utterly murderous go turn. Again, they're looking in a fairly good place really. Loads of enthusiasm to play the faction currently, sort of upper mid kind of performance, but not really looking overpowered. Maybe the biggest criticisms would be that Angron's disappointing where he really shouldn't be, and there's not really any good internal detachment balance. Berserker Warband just feels significantly better than the rest. For some more Space Marine melee violence of a different flavour, we've got the Black Templars, also on 51% wins, having risen very slightly since pre-update. Far lesser played, being the 16th most played faction of 40k, but still doing alright on the top table kind of performance. Their codex hadn't come out all that long before the balance update, so no changes there besides the core Space Marine ones, stay to things like Blade Guard veterans and a few others, and as a result they've remained in a fairly scary upper mid sort of position. For the detachments being used, the Codex ones were just weirdly restrictive and not really all that powerful for those restrictions, and as a result most people tend to use the Gladius Task Force. It just more directly does what the Black Templars need, allow you to advance and charge to get those scary melee units into close combat, and have access to some other things like some reactive moves and fights on death. The more generalist support doesn't hurt their other units like Repulsor Executioners too. For their standout units, their core threat tends to be 4 or 5 Sword Brethren with both a Marshal and Castellan attached, so you get some big rerolls and lethal hits on a 5+, and just bury the enemy with an enormous amount of damage to auto wounds or getting easy wound rolls in general from their core rule. Hellbrecht's another solid option to join them, and you certainly could do Crusader squads too. A combo like a Marshal and Lieutenant really isn't all that far behind on damage output, and they do have a fair bit of durability. Otherwise, the Emperor's Champion is a standout datasheet, really quite scary damage output, and is often seen with a small squad of Assault Intercessors who can lend him their rerolls. Grimaldus can be another option to join Assault Intercessors too. The Templar Repulsor Executioner got a weird win with being the best firepower for the army. It gets a bonus multi-melter and then a godly special rule allowing 4 rerolls to hit. It casts a shadow over just about any of the other Space Marine fire support, and I strongly suspect that it's going to get nerfed at the next balance pass. Otherwise the Impulse is pretty good as well as a battlefield bunker to charge out of with a multi-melter on top. Then beyond that, they'll get on well with any of the other Space Marine skirmish squads, and have just a little bit more threat in melee with them due to Templar vows. Overall feels like once again they're in a good spot power-wise, even if maybe their internal balance isn't ideal. It'd be nice to see an actual unique Templar melee detachment that can carry the army more so than Gladius. It would be good to see Crusader squads just a little bit more central and functional. I don't think they're maybe quite as far behind the Sword Brethren as plenty of people might suspect. Maybe a small points nudge one way or the other could help them out quite a bit. Next up, we've got the forces of the Four-Armed Emperor, who got some big changes and a fair few nerfs last time around. It still seems that the average Genestealer Cult player is doing okay with win rates around 51%. That seems to be the case in both competitive and casual, though definitely a bit worse than they were doing prior to the updates when they had one of the best performances in the game. It does seem that people are far less enthusiastic to play the faction though. They're the 26th most played out of the 28 armies. Only the tiny numbers of Deathwatch and Imperial Agents below them. What's a bit unusual for them is that they've not had any either event wins or 5-game undefeated runs, literally 0, so bottom place with the Imperial Agents there. I would guess there's probably some element of bad luck there due to having a tiny player base. Any one event could go a bit either way as to whether or not a player wins the last game or something. I feel like given more time and data would see them have a bit more success. For the last balance changes, they had some rather big nerfs to the Host of Ascension. Ridge Runners got pricier, as did some Atalan Jackals. The Primus got a big nerf to his rerolls, changing to a +1 to hit, and a couple of stratagems for the Host of Ascension were tones down. It wasn't all bad news though, as a few things got buffs. 10 strong squads of Pure Strains, Metamorphs and the Abominant all got cheaper, all pretty great news for the Biosantic Broodsurge, and Metamorphs were a fairly strong unit already, so it was very nice for them. For the Genestealer Cults, their most focused units do tend to be a bit detachment dependent. Perhaps for staples wherever are the Achilles Ridge Runner, still good enough for that AP debuff, and the bigger squad Mining Laser variant didn't get any worse. Small Acolytes and Neophyte squads to support, and Hybrid Metamorphs also seem pretty good wherever they are. For the most popular detachments now, it's now Biosantic Broodsurge and Final Day that seem to have taken over as the most common ways to play the army. Both look like they're doing pretty well, though data is kind of low. Host of Ascension definitely isn't the most played detachment anymore. For Biosantic Broodsurge, it's all the keyworded units, so Aberrants, Pure Strains with a Patriarch attached with a damage enhancement, and a Biophagist leading hybrids, often the Metamorphs. The Final Day tends to make very good use of Gargoyles and Tyranid Lone Operatives, and it's quite good for supporting Genestealer Cult shooting, maybe some Ridge Run and Mining Lasers or Neophyte blocks. For the host, it's still likely to be mainly the Neophyte blocks with character support, either the Primus or Biophagist, plus perhaps some melee threats with that easy charge enhancement. For army issues, they generally tend to be considered a higher skill faction to play. Lots of their guerrilla warfare tricks can often mean that they get the first jump on enemy units rather than the other way around, though between that and the option to recycle the odd unit, it does often mean their units have high points cost, at least relative to their overall damage and defense. It could mean there's some big decisions to be made between killing and objective play, and experienced players maybe have a bit more chance of getting them right and not falling foul of enemy counter moves like Overwatch or Heroic Intervention and things. Next up, and also on 51%, we have the Grey Knights. In terms of win rates, it seems that they rose up a fair bit after maybe an initial sort of lukewarm reception of their codex, though admittedly they still seem to be one of the very least played armies of Warhammer 40k. Perhaps their lack of model range updates not really helping with that though, and they maybe done sort of middling-ish in terms of top table performance recently. Due to a recent codex like the Black Templars, they didn't really get anything specific from the balance update, just the generic Land Raider drops, and for their success in game they're generally using the Warpbane Task Force detachment more than other things, the Purifier focus one that gives you some easy access to rerolls in their zone of control, plus a few helpful stratagems. The second most played ones tends to be the Banishers for some melee psychic damage, and the new style Mist of Deimos style stratagem. Most players don't seem to be doing quite so well with that one though, at least in terms of win rates and overall performance. For staple units in an army, there's usually 3+ Dread Knight bodies for tougher stuff, as most other units just don't punch up all that well. Often Grandmasters, though maybe supported by some regular ones. Purifiers are one of the scariest damage dealer units, often with a big unit with Castell and Crow for some absolutely murderous shooting, potentially with full wound rerolls against things on objectives, and good melee as well, though tend to be backed up by some smaller units too. At least one strike squad is usually wanted to sticky objective the home field. Interceptors are nice for utility with their move shoot move, and might be able to jump in and out of transports if you'd like to. The Grey Knight Razorback perhaps seems to be surprisingly effective at the moment, a nice buffing special rule for some extra AP, and also being really quite cheap with a las cannon on top of it. Does genuinely seem to get them played in competitive armies. Paladins can be alright, with some good damage on the charge, more so in Banishers lists or elsewhere than Warpbane though, and the Brotherhood Librarian might be an option to lead them, though can just do pretty well to go solo, and Deep Strike to be a cheap nuisance unit with a little bit of psychic firepower. Again, as a sort of upper mid win rate sort of army, they're not in the worst place in the world. Their teleport tricks might only really get them so far due to not delivering melee units to where they want to be, and they do have limited options for taking down really tough heavy vehicles, often having to rely on Dread Knights pretty exclusively for that. Purifiers can do well as well though. Gameplay wise, it's maybe a shame that the Codex detachments haven't been embraced a bit more, and if any units need a bit of help, it's probably the Brotherhood Terminators and the Paladins more than the rest. They're just not quite so commonly used as core damage combos. Probably the single biggest thing to fix for the Grey Knights, if anything though, is the model range. It's not really very helpful to have most people holding their breath for a refresh that's probably going to be coming in 11th edition. It's not going to tempt a lot of people to invest in new units for the faction. Next up, and side by side with Grey Knights, it seems it's the Chaos Demons. Win rates are around 52%, just a little bit higher than they were previously. And interestingly, it looks by Goonhammer's numbers, they look like they're the single most successful faction in casual play right now, with win rates of around 55%. Maybe doing around about mid-table on the top competitive kind of level, 8 event wins or similar, which is kind of mid when rated for the numbers, and their play rates are sort of middling as well at 17th out of the 28 factions. The last balance changes for the Demons were kind of minimal. The Keeper of Secrets got cheaper, and the Legion of Excess had a small buff, both weaker options that moved in the right direction, but maybe not quite enough to be utterly standout for the faction. For detachment performance, it still seems to be the Demon Incursion that's the single most popular, allowing easy charges from reserves, jumping units around the table, and doing close deep strikes and things, plus having really easy enhancements that can amp up the greater demons. The Shadow Legion being the next most popular between deity buffs, access to some Chaos Marine datasheets, and some good strats and enhancements. Most of the other deity ones at least see some play, and a little bit of success too. For their standout units at the moment, most of the Chaos Demon lists tend to go very monster mash heavy, Be'lakor often leading the way as a powerful datasheet in his own right, but shading the rest of the army nearby means that enemies can't shoot him at long range, which is very disruptive, plus his aura of Shadow of Chaos can allow for some very easy charge setups. He's often bringing along a big supporting cast of various different greater demons. The Great Unclean One with Endless Gift is pretty excellent in the Demonic Incursion. Rostages is nice. Both the Lord of Change and Fate Weaver are good, as are Scarbrand and the Bloodthirster. The Bloodthirster can have the rather nasty Return to Reserve stratagem in Shadow Legion if desired. It tends to be the greater demons doing most of the damage, maybe occasionally some buffed Bloodletters or Blood Crushers, and then around them you can have lots of utility units running around, infiltrating Nurglings, sticky objective Playbearers, Return to Reserve's Flesh Hounds to do secondaries, annoying cheap but tough beasts, and then Screamers and Flamers are both nice on the Tzeentch side of things. Overall, they've got good win numbers, though maybe a little bit underwhelming on the top event placings. They perhaps feel like with their big monster mash focus, they might have some of the issues of Knight armies, perhaps being rather dominant against armies that can't handle the stat check element of them, but that may be not working quite so well against more optimised armies at the top ends of play. Otherwise, still doesn't necessarily look like the Keeper of Secrets or Legion of Excess have been helped out too much by the changes so far, and perhaps for issues as a faction, their uncertain future given Games Workshop deciding against giving them a codex this edition is maybe more of an issue than anything else. Finally though, we get on to the top armies by win rate. It looks like the top end of Warhammer 40k has win rates stretching between 53 and 57% right now. On top of just having good win rates at grand tournaments, literally all of these have really good top table placings relative to the number of people playing them, being some of the armies with the best chance to win grand tournaments if you take them to events, maybe with Space Marines, Imperial Knights and Votann being quite close on that metric as well. As a result, these ones might be some of the armies that are most sticking their head above the parapet for balance adjustments. Though I think the general sense is that they're not feeling anywhere near as oppressive as the Knights or Death Guard. Their win rates and event wins aren't quite so high, and I think it also doesn't hurt that the top 3 here are all slightly lesser played factions, so you're nowhere near as likely to just face the same list over and over again. Pushing them on the graph, that leaves us with this. Here we have the Tau Empire on 53%, Aeldari on 54%, Deathwatch and Adepta Sororitas on 55%, and Admech at the top with 57% right now. For the Tau pre-updates, they were in the position where they had kind of low win rates, but still lots of people managing to get their way to the tops of tournaments. Games Workshop then buffed them, and now it looks like they have high win rates, and then lots and lots of people doing well in tournaments with them. Their win rates of 53% in competitive games, a bit lower casually, which I feel like has often been the case in the past. They're the 7th most played army overall, so quite a lot of enthusiasm to put them on the table currently. Though perhaps the most standout thing here is the number of either event wins or going the first 5 games undefeated at a big tournament, a big 18 of those there, equating to the 5th best on that metric by play rate. The last changes buffed a whole bunch of battle suits, a couple of the crisis suits units got cheaper, as did Broadsides and Commander Farside, and then the Riptide gained Strength 10 on its Ion Accelerator, which was a seriously good boost to an already strong unit. It feels like quite a lot of those went from usable to being top tier for the Tau as a result, alongside their other already good options. Tower detachments have been impressively well balanced relative to the rest of 40k. Out of their 6 detachments, literally all of them get used. Perhaps it's only really the fun experimental prototype cadre being a bit more obviously weaker than the rest, at least by recent numbers. Cowyon perhaps doing the single best, though they all add good stuff in their own ways, and playing a fairly full Kroot army in Kroot Hunting Pack does genuinely seem to be viable enough too. For strong units, Riptides might be one of the very most obvious ones now. It's not uncommon to see 3 per army list with their big strength 10 ion accelerators in hand now. Otherwise, for more auto-include stealth suits are pretty mandatory to provide fire support by marking things. Kroot Carnivores and Vespids can help out with sticky objectives and deep striking around the board. And a unit of Pathfinders typically gets taken for the infiltrate role, pairing some nice screening with some perhaps surprisingly heavy ion firepower. With heavy hitter big guns behind them, hammerheads, broadsides and sky rays can all do well. Strong damage against tanks and vehicles, and a ghost kill to hold the backfield and chip away with a little bit of weaker damage as the game goes on isn't bad. Then with the latest update point, the crisis suits came back a fair bit. There's definitely far more use of Sunforge and Fire Knife suits, often backed up by one of the flavours of Commander, and perhaps enhancements depending on detachments. Devilfish Breachers are definitely still a thing as well, swooping onto the mid-board, blasting things on objectives, and the rest of the Kroot units can be solid enough in their own detachments, and certainly Rampagers. They're fairly interesting for the raw stats and muscle elsewhere. They're certainly scary enough in Auxiliary and Hunting Pack. Basically the vast majority of the codex is pretty viable, as are most of their detachments, which is nice to see. There's plenty of people using other things I've not mentioned yet, like Farsight, Shadow Sun and Piranhas and stuff. Obviously they seem to be doing pretty well on all counts right now. For any weaknesses, they often maybe have a bit of a reputation for being a little harder to command in more casual play versus competitive. Their units can be fairly half-assed and hit hard, but not necessarily have all that much durability. And it means that you need to balance pushing up to get lines of sight versus not expending valuable things quite so fast. Riptides maybe just seem a little bit over-obvious as a way to go currently. I wouldn't be too surprised to see some points increases for them at some stage. And Tower do have a new stealth suit team coming out fairly shortly that looks like it's going to be a 5-man one. Depending on what the overall points cost and offering of that turns out to be, it might not necessarily be a good thing for such a core unit to get a rewrite. Quite a lot of firepower depends on their damage buffs. Overall though, they're certainly looking like they're in a strong and scary spot. Next up we have the Aeldari, and out of the armies in this top spot, they're the most played one. 54% wins, having risen up slightly since pre-update, and it's fairly similar for casual play as well. They're the 4th most played army out of 28 factions, and have a big 22 either tournament victories or top placings, which puts them 4th on that metric if you weight it by play rate. Just overall they seem to be doing absolutely excellently on every single metric. I was perhaps kind of surprised they didn't get a few points nerfs last time around. It did seem like one of the armies that might on paper take over a bit from Death Guard and the Knights. Instead they got a bit of a mix. A cheaper Avatar, Azamon, Dire Avengers and Wraithblades, maybe Azamon and the Dire Avengers being the most interesting for competitive lists, and just a couple of small nerfs to bigger squads of Swooping Hawks and smaller squads of Corsair Void Reavers. It didn't really feel like either of them were necessarily enough to take them out of the game though, even if there definitely seems to be more people running smaller squads of Hawks over bigger ones now. For detachments seeing competitive play, either the Aspect Host or the War Host tend to be the go-tos, and generally supporting a fairly similar roster of units from Aspect Warriors and Phoenix Lords. The Aspect Host has some inbuilt rerolls, a good damage stratagem, and the War Host has battle focus rules, a few more standard Aeldari movement tricks, and again a useful enough shooting stratagem, though both of them have the big return unit into a transport option, which they tend to use with a big squad of fire dragons with Fugan these days. Having a wave serpent cart them about, then they get out and absolutely obliterate something before retreating back into safety, so the opponent's really going to struggle to damage them before they do it again. Maybe Seer Council tends to be the next most played, though doesn't tend to have the success of the others. Besides that big central damage combo, the other 2 most played Phoenix Lords are Jane Zar with a squad of Howling Banshees, and Lycus with some Warp Spiders with some Power Blades, both nice and scary units that can rush the enemy from a pretty enormous distance. Then for objective support, smaller squads of Swooping Hawks and Warp Spiders can jump around while still putting out some damage on the enemy. Rangers are nice and expendable to infiltrate, and those smaller Void Reaver squads are still good for swooping onto objectives in the midboard and not worrying too much if they die. Otherwise, the other most notable aspect are the Dark Reapers, sometimes in a big squad with an Exarch, sometimes with Morgan Ra. And Eldrad Ulthran's another popular one to make an appearance, maybe alongside some Storm Guardians to protect him and put sticky objectives on the home field. For any issues for the Eldar right now, it does feel like there's maybe not a huge amount of unit diversity for the top list in the faction. It seems in competitive play they're maybe just a little bit solved as a faction. I feel like there's plenty more stuff viable, that they usually tend to be the exception to the rule, as opposed to a mainline way to play. You don't really see too many people using their very radically different detachments, such as the Wraith Host, for example. It's been nice to see a bit of a better balance between aspect builds and the other things. I guess with their current strength at the moment, it'd be pretty expected to see a few scattered points nerfs across a few of these units. I wouldn't say that huge ones are necessary though. And otherwise elsewhere in the Codex, it'd be quite nice if the Aeldari and Harlequins could stand on their own 2 feet and be strong armies in their own right. After Aeldari's initial fall from their big power trip, neither of those sub-factions has had quite so much success. Overall though, with their current power levels, I would be kind of surprised if Aeldari don't see some sort of balance changes next time around. Next up, and moving up to 55% win rates, and we have the Deathwatch. They got some points decreases in the balance update, and it gave them a really big boost, jumping all the way from around 46% wins to 55%. And that seems to be mirrored in casual play as well, with Goonhammer's numbers. Between being a niche faction and Games Workshop giving people a lot of uncertainty around collecting them, there's really not many people that play them though. They're the 27th most played faction out of the 28 in the game, though with their small numbers they've still managed quite a lot of placings on the top tables, 4 event wins or 5 game undefeated runs, though when weighted for the tiny number of people playing them, that puts them 3rd in the game. With their last balance changes, they had points cuts to the majority of their kill team units and the Watchmaster. It was nice to see a fair few drops to some of their staples. They put down the Indomitor kill team by an equal amount, which is maybe kind of surprising as it just made one of the best things even more dominant. It definitely did enough to give the faction a really good power boost though. And besides that, they had a few of the Codex Space Marine changes that maybe didn't impact the faction in a huge way, and now they've added in Kill Team Decimus as well. Though at least at current points cost, it feels like the Primaris Kill Team probably isn't going to be embraced on a competitive level in any sort of big way, at least not until points change. For their armies, they used their Black Spear detachment, a nice enough core damage rule, some good stratagems if maybe a slightly limited application ones with the special issue ammunition, at least they're quite efficient being able to split between kill teams, but some really quite solid enhancements including the Beacon Angelus for rapid ingress, the Thief of Secrets for big damage, and the Tome of Ectoclades for extra oath rerolls. Given how many of their things are super efficient on their kill team units, they make really big use of those in this. Perhaps the Indomitor Gravis armoured team might be the single biggest staple, really big hitting firepower that can use the stratagems and synergies well. It's quite common to see multiple units there, maybe one with a Gravis captain, and otherwise the regular veterans and the Terminators are both nice. Watchmasters or the Judas here to lead the veterans, and some people have been using a few more of the other kill teams after the points cuts too. Then as ever with the Divergent chapters, they have a good use of Space Marine support units, Infiltrators as they can't take scouts, Intercessors for sticky objectives, the Combi Lieutenant, and maybe a Stormspeeder Thunderstrike to mark targets for a +1 to wounds. Overall, the small number of players seem to be doing rather well with them right now. They can need a few really quite big decisions with where to use those big expensive kill teams and hopefully not get them killed quite so fast, but it looks like it's broadly coming together for the Deathwatch players so far. As with a few of the armies on this list, it feels like their biggest challenge is their weird sort of surviving in 40k due to a patch rather than anything else and not having a codex, and that certainly won't help people with feeling safe enough to start collecting them as a faction, given how many times they've reinterpreted their rules. It will be really quite nice to see the Corvus Blackstar get good as well, which probably seems unlikely when Games Workshop aren't enjoying balancing aircraft in 10th edition, but has a bit of a special relevance to Deathwatch as it's one of very few unique miniatures. Next up, and also on 55% wins, we have the Sisters of Battle. They were doing well prior to the balance updates, had a few buffs, but also a lot of the very scariest armies take serious nerfs, and as a result look like they've risen up a bit. Again, they've got slightly lower play rates, nowhere near as low as Deathwatch, but 21st out of the 28 armies by the amount of people who take them to grand tournaments. And again, the people playing them are getting some outsized top event placings, a massive great big 15 here, and that puts them second weighted by play rate, so Sisters players are one of the most likely factions to turn up and take some big events. The last balance changes weren't super enormous for them. Celestine went down in cost a bit, and Astrid and Agatha got a points cut. Maybe the biggest one was to the Retributors, which both got cheaper and also a much buffed special rule. That does seem to have done enough to convert them from being a pretty underwhelming unit to genuinely quite a scary one, and they have popped up in a fair few more lists as a result, and we have seen a few more Bringers of Flame lists going around. For detachments though, most people are playing either Hallowed Martyrs or Champions of Faith, both very widely played and doing well. Hallowed Martyrs has the rather nice character shenanigans with the ability to revive them on death, plus good support for melee units with stratagems and forcing the opponents to attack things they don't want to. Champions of Faith helps out a couple of units in the roster, both the Paragon Warsuits and the Celestian Sacrosancts, both of which tend to be staples. For staple units, 3 Paragon Warsuits and more than Val are hard to pass up in most attachments, just a catastrophic amount of damage if you can get them into the right targets. Castigators are excellent for some longer range firepower and debuffing enemy AP that could mark for other Castigators. Battle Sisters are nice for their sticky objectives and miracle dice farming shenanigans, often split into small efficient units with immolators. For some melee push with some medium durability units into the midboard, Celestian Sacrosancts often pair with a Hospitaller, often in 10 strong squads, and they get on well with the Champions of Faith, and Arco-Flagellants have some fairly nice fast movement and an absolute ton worth of melee attacks. Most of the elite units are significantly better than they were. Retributors, Dominions and Seraphim, maybe some Novitiates for the infiltrate role, and you could pair them with a fighty character for some rerolls. Some of their character support roster is maybe a bit overshadowed, though Junitharito with command point farming, and then fighty Palatines and Caranesses, they tend to be some of the staples. After several balance passes, the majority of things are pretty useful. Again, feels like it's maybe not too uncommon for them to have higher win rates at competitive play versus casual. They have fairly fragile units that are reliant on trading carefully and making the most of a limited pool of miracle dice to achieve some pretty brutal things. It does feel like these, like the rest, might be in a position where they might attract some nerfs next time around though, likely falling on some of the units that might be most auto-includes. Finally though, for our look through the 40k factions, we have the Adeptus Mechanicus in the top spot right now. Tournament win rates are around 57%, so having risen up an absolutely enormous amount since the last balance pass. Still doing very well in casual play as well, and like the sisters, taking down an enormous amount of top event placings and titles given the few amount of people playing them. Again, they're a somewhat niche faction, the 22nd most played army out of Warhammer 40k, but getting 20 top event placings or 5-0 undefeated runs, making them the most likely army for a player of the faction to do well. Again, they basically just seem to be doing best on all the stats, win rates near enough best, and doing well at the top levels of play too. The last update gave some pretty significant changes to make them more exciting and threatening. Core got the big sort of Oath of Moment style reroll buff, but got pricier. Iron Striders got a tiny bit pricier, but gains Twin Linked, which was a big win for them. Ruststalkers gained a damage 2 option, which certainly seems to have been embraced pretty well. Infiltrators got buffed for some reason, despite already being excellent, and Orange Dune Crawlers got a weapon change. I feel like that was maybe the least impactful, though all the rest added a big thing. For detachment, it's the Halo Screed Battleclade that's the most popular, selecting a few units for some powerful boosts, and then having some nice stratagems to support. The Skitarii Hunter cohort also does very well, supporting a slightly narrower class of units with the sort of sneaky infiltrate style shenanigans, plus some good enhancements for marshals. For strong units, Belisarius Core is basically kind of auto-include, being able to hand out that massive damage buff. He can add to the amount of damage an army can put out in a pretty staggering way, and still has some fighty stats of his own. Some of these Skitarii troops are generally needed for buffs, usually at least some Rangers and at least some Vanguard. They make the Doctriners function a bit better, plus some datasheet rules. For anti-tank firepower, it tends to be a mix of Scorpius Disintegrator shooting or Iron Striders with las cannons or both. The Iron Striders in particular are excellent anti-tank firepower now they've been added Twin Links for very little extra cost. Of other gunline elements, Arc Rifle Breaches are still solid with their rerolls, though given Core's sort of pseudo Oath of Moment thing, the Cataphrone Destroyers have seen more use, the Plasma ones in particular with the big rerolls to hit. Otherwise, Taraxia, both flavours are nice to run around doing objectives. Infiltrators are basically auto-include with good stat lines and are very nice to secure the midboard, and Ruststalkers often tend to be a central damage combo, rushing the enemy with lots of damage 2 weapons with their easy access to advance and charge. Overall, it seems that they've jumped straight from underwhelming to probably going to get nerfed, looking like they're on paper the single strongest faction of Warhammer 40k. I wouldn't be too surprised if Core's cost goes up just a bit more to reflect that big boost he has, and maybe some of the other units that got buffs but not really much of a points raise. Both the Iron Striders and Infiltrators seem pretty excellent for the points cost currently. It is quite nice to finally have Admech have a bit of time in the sun though, after being in a slightly sorry state for the majority of 10th edition, and maybe don't feel quite as oppressive as the Death Guard and Knight meta, given that they're just not quite as widely played and you're not quite so likely to run into people playing Admech. That's about it for the main factions though, and to round up, here's just a few of the metrics that we've talked about, set out by a list of 28 factions in the game. These are the number of Grand Tournament event wins, or armies that have gone the first 5 games unbeaten, which shows potential event winning performances at other huge tournaments. It is nice to see quite a lot of factions winning quite a lot here, and almost everything winning some. Space Marines, Aeldari, Admech, Tau, Sisters and Chaos Knights seem to be taking the top spot there, with plenty more not far behind. Just Imperial Agents and Genestealer Cults that I've not seen one of these for yet. Given some of these armies are played far more or far less than others though, here's the number of top performances when weighted for the amount of people playing them. It can be a bit random and dependent on the performance of a few key players, though safe to say that the Admech and Sisters are doing rather well on this front, with Aeldari, Tau and Space Marines not being so far behind. This one feels like it really zeroes in on some of the armies that are widely played and do well for win rates but not really so well at the very top levels. For example, Custodes, Death Guard and Imperial Knights being towards the lower ends here, and World Eaters not having so much success despite loads of people playing them. Talking of play rates, here's the rough numbers of play rates for people taking the factions to big tournaments, both a bit of perception of relative power and fun factor, and also how many people collect the faction. We've got Space Marines, then World Eaters, Death Guard, Aeldari and Necrons at the top there, followed closely by Tyranids, Tau and Chaos Knights. It still feels like World Eaters and Death Guard are disproportionately high here, both maybe in fairly fun places where a fair few of their units are really quite strong and interesting. Down at the bottom there's a fair few of the usual culprits that aren't collected quite as widely. Not really any enormous surprise to see Genestealer Cult, Deathwatch and Imperial Agents make up the bottom three. Maybe a little surprising that a few more people haven't embraced Deathwatch, given how well they seem to be doing right now, though I guess it might be quite a lot of efforts to collect together a competitive Deathwatch list. Thousand Sons are also kind of noticeably low compared with where they've been recently. Here's the numbers for some more casual win rates from Goonhammer's Warhammer 40K Stats Center. These ones via their Tabletop Battles app, so account for people playing casually or doing RTTs and things. Quite a lot of the list seems rather similar, but typically they tend to be outsized gains for any of the stat check armies, so things like the Custodes, the Chaos Knights, and I guess the Chaos Demons at the moment with their big greater demons are doing better here than they might do elsewhere. And a few of the armies that are maybe a bit trickier to master might not do quite as well as on the big win rates. These honestly might be more relevant numbers though for people playing casually and you're not druking it out in grand tournaments anytime soon. And then finally, here are the win rates overall for Warhammer 40k Grand Tournaments, so typically with more optimised lists. And while they're not the whole story, it does feel like the top 5 are doing rather well in terms of actually topping events, as well as just being strong at winning games. Overall though, I must say that Warhammer 40k game balance is in probably the best state that it's pretty much ever been in my opinion. Pretty much every faction has strong stuff, there's not too many oppressive things at the top of the meta, and bar just a few exceptions, the vast majority of most armies' units are actually playable in some way or form. I feel like for a lot of these armies, in the notable unit section, I've just been talking through really quite a big chunk of their codex, as opposed to just a few unique units that are clearly better than the rest. How do the stats and numbers match up with your experiences of your faction? I look forward to hearing your takes down in the comments. That's about it for this one though before I go, I'll just cycle back to Futureproof Modular Terrain, the sponsor of today's video, and makers of their sculpted plastic terrain sets. Relative to other 40k terrain offerings out there, they do quite a lot of things well in my opinion. If you do like the general look and feel of them, there's not that many sets out there that both have sculpted plastic detail, plus the option to come pre-painted, with also the ability to take them apart or reassemble them if you'd like to, and also be fairly practical and functional Warhammer 40k terrain. They do well for terrain footprints and blocking line of sight and things. Probably the biggest downside for it is that they will tend to be more expensive than, say, the cheapest entry MDF type terrains. They are very much pitching themselves at the slightly more expensive end of the market. There's still very much nothing on what Games Workshop would likely charge for such a table. Otherwise, for any other small criticisms, while you can take the bits apart, it's probably not something I'd want to do too often, more of an option than something that I'd like to be doing on the regular. And putting them together can be just a bit of a learning process. You do need to be a little bit thoughtful about where you use the bits to disguise the tabs and ruins and things, making sure that you have good use of the top bits on the highest reach of the terrain to disguise some tabs. If you go a bit freeform, you might be left over with extra amounts of certain one bits that you've not used. In general though, they do a fairly good job. The main sets are built around these components that go together like building blocks. And they sell entire terrain sets like this full table set, which is currently around $240 unpainted, or around $300 or so painted depending on the colour scheme. They've got really quite a few colour schemes to choose from, things like desert tables to royal worlds, then some World War style ones with sort of painted on sandbags, death worlds with overgrown ruins, and plenty more including some trippy ones like that cursed world. They've got a few other offerings as well, including big super bundles or half table sets, and a bunch more pieces that can come as a big super bundle, or you can get specific add-ons depending on exactly what you're trying to build. In any case, there'll be links below in the video description. A big thank you to them for sponsoring this one. I'll leave that there for now though. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, with new ones out just about every day. If you've been enjoying all the videos on the channel, Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description. Channel patrons get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link's in the video description below. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.